The morning briefing fell silent when Colonel Hayes mentioned her name. Every pilot in the room knew the story of Captain Sarah Chen and the F-16 that vanished over the Alaskan wilderness 8 years ago. They knew about the search and rescue missions that found nothing but scattered debris. They knew about the memorial service and the flag given to her parents. What they didn't know was that somewhere in the frozen expanse of the Northern Territories, a ghost had been watching and waiting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Jessica Park had always been different from the other pilots at Fairfield Air Base. While her colleagues spent their downtime playing poker or discussing the latest aircraft upgrades, she preferred to sit alone in the maintenance hangar, studying the older jets that most considered relics. Her fellow aviators found her obsession with vintage aircraft amusing at best, concerning at worst. They called her Museum behind her back, a nickname that stung more than she let on. The nickname had started during her first week at Fairfield, when she'd been caught reading a technical manual for the F-4 Phantom, instead of familiarizing herself with the base's newer F-35 Lightning II aircraft. Major Thompson, the squadron's second-in-command, had discovered her hunched over the yellowed pages in the pilot's lounge at 2 in the morning. Instead of reprimanding her for being out of quarters, he'd simply shaken his head and muttered something about living in the past. By the next morning, everyone knew about the new pilot who preferred museum pieces to modern marvels. Jessica's fascination with older aircraft wasn't born from nostalgia or romanticism. She understood something that her peers seemed to miss. These machines had been built during an era when reliability mattered more than sophistication. Every rivet, every wire, every component had been designed with brutal simplicity in mind. They were aircraft that could take damage and keep flying, that could operate in conditions that would ground their modern counterparts. But try explaining that to pilots who'd grown up with heads-up displays and fly-by-wire systems. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Jessica arrived at the flight line before dawn, her breath visible in the crisp October air. Fairfield Air Base sat nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains that stretched endlessly toward the Canadian border. The base itself was a study in contrasts. Gleaming new hangars housing the latest fighter jets stood alongside corrugated metal buildings that had weathered decades of harsh winters. In the distance, the control tower rose like a concrete monument to military precision, its windows already glowing with the soft light of early morning operations. Jessica made her way to Hangar 7, the forgotten corner of the base where the older aircraft were stored. Most pilots avoided this area entirely, considering it a graveyard for obsolete technology. But for Jessica, it was a sanctuary. Here, among the shadows and dust motes, sat her assigned aircraft, an F-16 Fighting Falcon that had first taken to the skies when her father was still learning to walk. The jet bore the tail number 860247, and its service record read like a history of American air power. It had patrolled the skies over Iraq during the Gulf War, had flown combat missions in Afghanistan, and had survived more near misses than any aircraft had a right to. The paint was faded in places, and the cockpit showed the wear of thousands of flight hours. But the engines were solid, and the avionics, while outdated, were perfectly functional. Jessica ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the slight imperfections, where patches had been welded over battle damage. Most pilots saw only an old machine that belonged in a museum. Jessica saw a survivor, a warrior that had earned its scars through service and sacrifice. She understood that in aviation, as in life, there was something to be said for proven reliability over flashy innovation. The other pilots had begun arriving for the morning briefing, their voices carrying across the tarmac as they discussed weekend plans and complained about the early hour. Jessica gathered her flight gear, a worn helmet that had belonged to her instructor at flight school, a pair of gloves that she'd carefully maintained for the past 3 years, and a flight suit that bore the patches of every squadron she'd served with. Unlike her colleagues, who seemed to acquire new equipment with the enthusiasm of children on Christmas morning, Jessica preferred gear that had been tested by time and experience. Captain Rodriguez appeared at the hangar entrance, his silhouette backlit by the growing dawn. He was one of the few pilots who'd ever shown Jessica any real respect, though even he seemed puzzled by her preferences. Rodriguez flew one of the base's newer F-35s, and he'd often tried to convince Jessica that she was limiting herself by sticking with older aircraft. Their conversations always ended the same way, with Rodriguez shaking his head and Jessica quietly returning to her work. "Morning, Museum," Rodriguez called out, using the nickname with none of the malice that others injected into it. "You come into briefing, or are you planning to spend another morning polishing that antique?" Jessica looked up from where she'd been inspecting the landing gear. "She's not an antique, she's experienced." Rodriguez laughed, but it wasn't unkind. Experienced is one word for it. Old is another. He glanced at his watch. "Hayes wants everyone in the briefing room in 10 minutes. Something about a training exercise that's been moved up." Jessica nodded and began gathering her things. She'd learned long ago that punctuality was one of the few qualities the other pilots respected about her. If she was going to be different, at least she could be reliable in her differences. She secured her aircraft and followed Rodriguez across the tarmac toward the main briefing facility. The briefing room was a sterile environment that smelled of industrial carpet and bird coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow. Maps covered the walls, showing the geography of Alaska and the Northern Territories in minute detail. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed the base's current operational status, with aircraft assignments and pilot rotations updated in real time. Jessica took her usual seat near the back, away from the clusters of pilots who'd formed their own informal hierarchies, based on aircraft assignments and combat experience. She opened her notebook, an actual paper notebook, which drew smirks from pilots who relied entirely on digital tablets and prepared to take notes. Her handwriting was precise and economical, a skill she developed during her academy days, when taking notes by hand was still considered acceptable. Colonel Hayes entered the room with the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years earning his authority one difficult decision at a time. His gray hair was perfectly regulation, and his uniform showed the creases that came from decades of military discipline. Hayes had flown everything from crop dusters to supersonic fighters, and his office wall displayed enough commendations to outfit a small museum. Despite his impressive credentials, he'd always treated Jessica with the same professional courtesy. He showed everyone else, which was more than could be said for some of his subordinators. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I know some of you were expecting to spend today running routine patrol patterns, but circumstances have changed. We've received word that a commercial airliner has gone missing somewhere in the northern sectors, and we're being asked to assist in search and rescue operations." A murmur ran through the assembled pilots. Search and rescue missions were serious business, requiring precision flying and the ability to operate in challenging conditions for extended periods. Jessica felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the anticipation that came before any important mission. Hayes continued, pulling up a map on the main display. "The aircraft in question is a twin-engine passenger jet that lost contact with air traffic control approximately 6 hours ago. Last known position was here, roughly 200 miles northeast of our location. Weather conditions in the search area are marginal, with low visibility and gusty winds expected throughout the day." Major Thompson stepped forward to address the flight assignments. Thompson was everything that Jessica was not: tall, confident, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made other pilots want to follow him into combat. He flew the newest F-35 on the base, And he'd made it clear on numerous occasions that he considered older aircraft a liability rather than an asset. "We'll be running this operation with our primary aircraft," Thompson announced. "Martinez, you'll take lead position in Lightning 1. Foster, you'll fly wing in Lightning 2. We'll have Rodriguez and Wilson providing high-altitude overwatch in Lightning 3 and 4. He continued down the list, assigning the bases. Most modern aircraft to what he clearly considered the most important mission of the year. Jessica waited for her name to be called, her pen poised over her notebook. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd participated in search and rescue training exercises before, and she knew that her F-16, while older, was perfectly capable of sustained flight operations in challenging weather. The F-16 had been designed for versatility, and its proven track record in adverse conditions made it an ideal platform for this kind of mission. Thompson reached the end of his list without mentioning Jessica's name. She looked up from her notebook, wondering if she'd missed something. Around the room, the other pilots were already discussing flight plans and coordination protocols. The excitement in their voices was palpable. This was the kind of mission that reminded them why they'd chosen to become military aviators. "Sir," Jessica said, raising her hand slightly, "what about my assignment?" Thompson looked at her with the expression of someone who'd forgotten about an unwelcome obligation. "Park, you'll be remaining on base today. We need someone to handle communications and coordinate with civilian authorities." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. Communications duty was typically assigned to non-flying personnel or pilots who were being disciplined for some infraction. It was busy work, the kind of assignment given to people who couldn't be trusted with more important responsibilities. Around the room, she could see other pilots avoiding eye contact, some of them clearly uncomfortable with Thompson's decision. "Sir, with respect, my aircraft is fully operational, and I'm current on all search and rescue protocols," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice level. "I believe I could contribute to the mission." Thompson's expression hardened. "Your aircraft is a 30-year-old relic that belongs in a museum. Park, this is a serious operation, not a flight demonstration for vintage aircraft enthusiasts. We need pilots flying modern equipment, not hobbyists playing with antiques." The room fell silent. Jessica felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain composed. She'd endured worse criticism before, though rarely in front of so many of her peers. The other pilots studied their tablets or stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her eyes. Even Rodriguez, who'd always been supportive, seemed suddenly fascinated by something on his notepad. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, warming to his theme, "search and rescue operations require aircraft with modern navigation systems and advanced communication equipment. Your F-16 might have been cutting-edge technology when your parents were in high school, but it's not suitable for contemporary operations. We can't afford to have someone flying around in a museum piece when lives are at stake." Jessica closed her notebook carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. She'd learned long ago that showing emotion in front of her peers would only make things worse. The military had no patience for pilots who couldn't handle criticism, even when that criticism was unfair or unprofessional. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet. "Understood, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'll report to communications." As she walked toward the door, Jessica could hear Thompson resuming his briefing, his voice taking on the animated tone of someone discussing a challenging but exciting mission. The other pilots began asking questions about flight patterns and search grids, their enthusiasm undimmed by what had just transpired. By the time Jessica reached the hallway, the briefing room was buzzing with the kind of energy that accompanied important operations. Jessica made her way to the communications center, a cramped room filled with radio equipment and computer terminals. The duty officer, a young sergeant named Williams, looked up in surprise when she entered. Williams was used to working alone during flight operations, coordinating with air traffic control and monitoring emergency frequencies while the pilots were airborne. "Lieutenant Park?" "I wasn't expecting anyone else this morning," Williams said. Confusion evident in his voice. "Change of plans, Sergeant. I'll be helping with communications for the search and rescue operation," Jessica replied, settling into a chair at one of the unused terminals. Williams nodded, though he still looked puzzled. "Okay, ma'am. Most of the coordination will be handled through the primary frequencies, but we'll need to monitor civilian emergency channels in case the missing aircraft tries to make contact." Jessica spent the next hour familiarizing herself with the communication protocols while listening to the search aircraft conduct their pre-flight checks. Through the small window that overlooked the flight line, she could see the F-35s being prepared for departure. Ground crews swarmed around the sleek aircraft, conducting final inspections and loading emergency equipment. The jets themselves seemed to gleam with purpose, their angular designs reflecting the morning sun like metallic arrows pointed toward the sky. At precisely 0800 hours, the search aircraft began their takeoff sequence. Jessica watched through the window as each jet accelerated down the runway, their engines producing the distinctive roar that marked the beginning of every important mission. One by one, they lifted into the gray October sky, their navigation lights blinking as they formed up and headed northeast toward the search area. Jessica turned back to her radio equipment and settled in for what she knew would be a long day of monitoring frequencies and coordinating with civilian authorities. The communication center was quiet except for the occasional burst of radio chatter from air traffic control. Through her headset, she could hear the search aircraft reporting their positions as they spread out across the vast wilderness of northern Alaska. The first hour passed without incident. The search teams reported normal flight conditions and began establishing their search patterns according to the plan that Thompson had outlined during the briefing. Jessica found herself genuinely hoping that the mission would be successful, despite her disappointment at being excluded from the operation. Somewhere out there, passengers and crew members were depending on the skills and dedication of military aviators to find them and guide rescue teams to their location. As the morning progressed, however, Jessica began to notice changes in the radio chatter that concerned her. The pilots were reporting increasingly difficult weather conditions, with visibility dropping and wind speeds higher than forecast. What had started as a straightforward search and rescue operation was becoming a test of flying skills and aircraft capabilities. "Lightning II to base, visibility is down to less than 2 miles and decreasing," came Foster's voice through the radio, requesting permission to descend to a lower altitude. "Base to Lightning II, negative on altitude change. Maintain current flight level for terrain clearance," came the response from air traffic control. Jessica frowned as she listened to the exchange. She'd flown in similar conditions before, and she knew that sometimes the difference between mission success and failure came down to a pilot's willingness to operate at the edge of safety margins. The F-35s were remarkable aircraft, but their sophisticated systems weren't always an advantage in challenging weather conditions. Sometimes simpler was better. 20 minutes later, Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with a note of frustration. "Base, Lightning I reporting mechanical difficulties. My navigation system is showing conflicting readings, and I'm having trouble maintaining accurate position." Jessica sat up straighter, her attention focused entirely on the radio traffic. Navigation problems in poor weather were serious issues that could quickly escalate into emergency situations. She glanced at the topographical maps on the wall, trying to visualize where the search aircraft were operating in relation to the terrain below. "Lightning I, base copies your mechanical difficulties. Can you troubleshoot the problem?" Came the response from air traffic control. "Negative, base. The system appears to be experiencing some kind of software conflict. I'm going to need to rely on backup navigation for the remainder of the mission." Jessica felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Software conflicts were the kind of problems that plagued modern aircraft, particularly in challenging environmental conditions. The F-35's advanced systems were designed to operate flawlessly under ideal circumstances. But Alaska's harsh weather had a way of exposing weaknesses in even the most sophisticated technology. Over the next hour, the situation continued to deteriorate. Rodriguez reported intermittent communication problems with his aircraft's radio system. Wilson experienced a brief engine warning that cleared itself, but left him concerned about continuing the mission at full power. One by one, the search aircraft were encountering the kinds of technical difficulties that transformed routine operations into exercises in crisis management. Base Lightning III requesting permission to return to base. Rodriguez's voice finally came through the radio, heavy with disappointment. "I'm experiencing multiple system warnings, and I don't feel comfortable continuing the mission in these weather conditions." Jessica listened as air traffic control granted Rodriguez permission to abort his portion of the search. Through the window, she could see his F-35 approaching the base, its landing lights cutting through the overcast sky. One by one, the other search aircraft followed suit, their pilots making the difficult decision to prioritize safety over mission completion. By noon, all of the search aircraft had returned to base, their crews frustrated and empty-handed. The missing airliner remained missing, and the weather conditions that had forced the military jets to abort their mission showed no signs of improving. In the communications center, Jessica continued monitoring emergency frequencies, hoping against hope that she might pick up some sign of the missing aircraft. Colonel Hayes appeared in the communications center doorway, his expression grim. He'd spent the morning coordinating with civilian authorities and other military installations, trying to organize a comprehensive search effort that was being hampered by weather and mechanical difficulties. "Any word from civilian search and rescue?" Hayes asked, settling into a chair beside Jessica's workstation. "Negative, sir. The Coast Guard has aircraft on standby, but they're dealing with the same weather conditions that forced our people back. No one's had any luck penetrating the search area." Hayes nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. "What about emergency frequencies? Any chance the missing aircraft is trying to transmit distress signals?" Jessica had been monitoring every available frequency since the search began, listening for any sign that might indicate survivors. "Nothing so far, sir. But if they're down in a valley or behind one of the mountain ridges, their signal might not be strong enough to reach us." Hayes stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the overcast sky. "We've got 63 people on that aircraft park, passengers and crew, including families with children. Somewhere out there, they're waiting for us to find them, and we're sitting here grounded by weather and equipment failures." Jessica understood the weight of command that Hayes was carrying. As base commander, he was responsible not only for the success of military operations, but also for the safety of his personnel. The decision to abort the search mission had been the right one from a safety standpoint, but that didn't make it any easier to accept when lives were at stake. "Sir, if I may," Jessica said carefully, "my aircraft is still fully operational. The F-16 systems are less susceptible to the kind of weather-related problems that the F-35s experience today." Hayes turned from the window, his expression thoughtful but skeptical. "Park, I appreciate your willingness to help, but Major Thompson made some valid points this morning. Search and rescue operations require modern navigation and communication equipment. Your F-16 may be reliable, but it's not equipped for this kind of mission." Jessica had expected this response, but she'd also spent the morning thinking about the problem from a different angle. "Sir, with respect, maybe modern equipment isn't what we need right now. The F-16 has mechanical flight instruments that don't depend on software or satellite links. In weather conditions like this, sometimes simpler is more reliable. Hayes studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of her proposal. Jessica could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the desire to continue the search mission warring with his responsibility to avoid unnecessary risks. Even if I were inclined to authorize such a mission, Park, you'd be flying alone in extremely hazardous conditions. No wingmen, no backup support, no way for us to assist you if you run into trouble. I understand the risk, sir. But those people have been missing for over 12 hours now. If they survived the initial incident, they're running out of time. Someone needs to try. Hayes returned to his chair, leaning back and closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Jessica could see that he'd reached a decision. I'm sorry, Park, but I can't authorize a single aircraft search mission in these conditions. It's too dangerous, and frankly, I'm not convinced that your aircraft is the right tool for the job. Jessica felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to nod professionally. Understood, sir. Hayes stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. Park, I want you to know that your dedication to service is noted and appreciated. But sometimes the best way to serve is to accept that not every mission can be accomplished. We'll resume search operations as soon as weather conditions improve. After Hayes left, Jessica sat alone in the communications center, continuing to monitor the radio frequencies while struggling with her own frustration. Outside, the weather continued to deteriorate, with low clouds and gusty winds that would make flying extremely challenging even for experienced pilots. She knew that Hayes had made the right decision from a command standpoint, but that knowledge didn't make it any easier to accept. As the afternoon wore on, Jessica found herself thinking about the missing airliner and the people aboard. She imagined families huddled together in the wreckage, injured passengers waiting for help that might never come, crew members doing their best to keep everyone alive in impossible circumstances. Somewhere out there, 63 people were counting on professionals like her to find them and coordinate their rescue. The radio crackled with occasional transmissions from air traffic control and civilian agencies, but nothing that indicated any progress in locating the missing aircraft. Jessica continued her vigil, adjusting frequencies and checking equipment, hoping that she might hear something that others had missed. The communication center began to feel like a prison, a place where she was forced to listen to other people's heroic efforts, while being denied the chance to contribute her own skills to the mission. As evening approached, Jessica realized that she'd been sitting in the same chair for nearly 10 hours, monitoring frequencies and coordinating with agencies that had nothing to report. Her back ached, her eyes burned from staring at computer screens, and her frustration had evolved into something approaching despair. The missing airliner remained missing. The weather conditions showed no signs of improving, and she was no closer to helping those 63 people than she'd been that morning. It was then, as she was preparing to hand off communications duty to the night shift, that everything changed. Through her headset, barely audible above the static and interference, Jessica heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a voice, weak and broken, transmitting on an emergency frequency that most people had forgotten existed. This is Flight 447. Anyone, please respond. We're alive. We need help. Jessica's hands flew to her radio controls, fine-tuning the frequency and boosting the signal strength. The transmission was fragmentary and filled with static, but it was definitely a human voice calling for help. Her heart raced as she realized that she might be the only person at the base who was monitoring that particular frequency. Flight 447. This is Fairfield Air Base. We copy your transmission. Please repeat your position and status. For several seconds, there was nothing but static. Then, so faint that Jessica had to strain to hear it, the voice came again. Fairfield. Thank God. We crashed. Mountain Valley. Many injured. Running out of time. Jessica grabbed a notepad and began scribbling down everything she could make out from the broken transmission. The signal was too weak and intermittent for her to get a clear position report, but she was able to determine that there were survivors and that they were in desperate need of rescue. The voice belonged to someone who was clearly exhausted and possibly injured, but who was doing their best to maintain communication with the outside world. Flight 447, we're going to get help to you. Can you give us any landmarks or identifying features of your location? Valley, surrounded by peaks. Wreckage scattered, we can see. Aircraft parts. Old military jet. Jessica's blood ran cold at those last words. An old military jet in a remote valley could mean only one thing. They'd found the crash site where Captain Sarah Chen had died 8 years ago. The location had never been precisely determined despite extensive search efforts, but if the airliner had gone down in the same area, it would explain why rescue teams were having such difficulty locating the wreckage. Jessica's mind raced as she considered her options. She could report the transmission to Colonel Hayes and wait for him to organize a rescue mission, but that would take hours to coordinate and might be too late for the survivors. She could try to relay the information to civilian rescue agencies, but they were already grounded by the same weather conditions that had forced the military aircraft to abort their searches. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do: take initiative in a crisis situation and act on her best judgment to save lives. Jessica looked around the communication center, confirming that she was alone. Sergeant Williams had gone to dinner, and the night shift wouldn't arrive for another hour. The base was quiet, with most personnel either in the dining facility or back in their quarters. Outside, her F-16 sat waiting in Hangar 7, fueled and ready for flight. For the first time in her military career, Lieutenant Jessica Park was about to disobey a direct order. The transmission from Flight 447 crackled through Jessica's headset again. Weaker this time, the voice more strained. She could hear the desperation bleeding through the static, the exhaustion of someone who had been calling for help for hours without response. The survivors were running out of time, and she was the only person who knew they were still alive. Jessica's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the radio controls, trying to maintain the fragile connection. The emergency frequency that Flight 447 was using had been largely abandoned by modern aircraft in favor of newer digital communication systems. It was an old channel, the kind that vintage aircraft like her F-16 were still equipped to monitor. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very technology Thompson had dismissed as obsolete was now the only thing standing between 63 people and certain death. Flight 447, this is Fairfield Air Base. I'm going to need you to stay on this frequency and keep transmitting. We're going to find you. The response came back fragmented, filled with interference from the storm systems moving through the northern territories. Copy. Fairfield. We'll try. Battery power. Running low, some people. Very badly hurt. Jessica closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to process the situation logically, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The survivors were in a remote valley, probably the same location where Captain Sarah Chen had crashed 8 years ago. The area was notorious for its unpredictable weather patterns and treacherous terrain. Multiple search and rescue attempts had been launched over the years to find Chen's wreckage, but the combination of mountainous topography and severe weather had defeated every effort. Now there were new victims in that same deadly landscape, and the military's most advanced aircraft had already proven unable to reach them. The F-35s with their sophisticated systems had been forced to abort their missions due to equipment failures and hazardous conditions. The weather was getting worse, not better, and conventional rescue operations would be impossible until the storm systems passed through the region. Jessica stood up from her workstation and walked to the large topographical map mounted on the wall of the communications center. Her eyes traced the mountain ranges northeast of Fairfield Air Base, looking for the kind of terrain features that would match the survivor's description. There were dozens of valleys in that region, most of them accessible only by helicopter or on foot. If Flight 447 had indeed crashed near Chun's wreckage site, they were in one of the most remote and dangerous areas in Alaska. The radio crackled again, pulling Jessica's attention back to her headset. "Fairfield, please. Children on board. Some passengers. Hypothermia. We need help soon." Children. The word hit Jessica like a physical blow. She'd been thinking about the survivors in abstract terms, as numbers and statistics rather than as real people with families and futures. The knowledge that there were children among the crash victims transformed the situation from a professional challenge into a moral imperative. Someone had to try to reach them, regardless of the risks involved. Jessica returned to her workstation and began gathering information about current weather conditions in the search area. The meteorological data painted a grim picture of deteriorating visibility, increasing wind speeds, and the possibility of severe icing conditions at higher altitudes. It was exactly the kind of weather that grounded conventional aircraft and made search and rescue operations nearly impossible. But Jessica knew something that the meteorologists and mission planners didn't fully appreciate. The F-16 fighting Falcon had been designed during an era when pilots were expected to fly and fight in all weather conditions. Unlike modern aircraft that relied heavily on computer systems and satellite navigation, the F-16 could be flown manually using basic instruments and dead reckoning navigation. It was a skill that few contemporary pilots bothered to master, but Jessica had spent countless hours practicing old-school flying techniques. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that her aircraft might be the only machine capable of reaching the crash site in current conditions. The F-16's proven reliability in adverse weather, combined with her knowledge of traditional navigation methods, gave her a realistic chance of success where high-tech solutions had failed. Jessica picked up her headset and tried to re-establish contact with Flight 447. For several minutes, there was nothing but static and interference. Then, just as she was beginning to fear that the survivor's radio had failed completely, she heard the voice again. "Fairfield, are you there? Please respond. Flight 447, I'm still here. I need you to conserve your battery power, but try to give me any additional information about your location. Can you see any distinctive landmarks or terrain features?" There was a long pause before the response came back. "Rocky peaks. Very steep. Wreckage is scattered. We found old aircraft. Military markings. Tail number hard to read." Jessica's heart raced as she realized that her suspicions were correct. The survivors had indeed crashed near the site where Captain Sarah Chen had died 8 years ago. Chun's F-16 had been carrying tail number 860193, and despite extensive search efforts, the wreckage had never been recovered. The fact that Flight 447 survivors could see military aircraft debris meant they were in the exact location that had defeated every previous rescue attempt. The irony of the situation was staggering. Captain Sarah Chen had died trying to complete a routine training mission in bad weather, becoming another casualty of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Now, 8 years later, civilian passengers were stranded in the same location, facing the same deadly combination of harsh weather and isolation that had claimed Xian's life. Jessica made her decision. She gathered her flight gear from the locker beside her workstation, checking each item carefully despite her sense of urgency. Her helmet was old but well-maintained, the communication systems compatible with the F-16's analog radio equipment. Her survival vest contained emergency signaling devices, medical supplies, and enough food and water to sustain her for several days if necessary. Most importantly, her flight suit had been modified with additional pockets for paper, maps, and navigation tools that didn't depend on satellite signals or computer systems. Before leaving the communication center, Jessica wrote a detailed message explaining the situation and her intended course of action. She left the note on her workstation where the night shift would find it, along with all the frequency information and position data she'd gathered from Flight 447. If something happened to her during the rescue attempt, at least the information would be available for follow-up operations. The walk to Hangar 7 felt longer than usual, each step taking her further from the safety of following orders and deeper into uncharted territory. Jessica had never disobeyed a direct command before, and the weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But every time she wavered, she thought about the children trapped in that remote valley, their lives depending on someone being willing to take risks that others wouldn't accept. Hangar 7 was dark and quiet, illuminated only by the emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Jessica's F-16 sat exactly where she'd left it that morning, seemingly unchanged by the day's events. But as she approached the aircraft, Jessica could swear that something was different about it. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound, as if the machine itself understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Jessica began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during flight school. She checked every external component, looking for signs of damage or wear that might compromise the aircraft's performance. The F-16 had been maintained to exacting standards despite its age, and Jessica found nothing that would prevent it from flying safely in challenging conditions. The aircraft's fuel tanks were full, having been serviced that morning in preparation for routine training flights that had been canceled due to the search and rescue operation. Jessica calculated that she had enough fuel for approximately 4 hours of flight time, which should be sufficient to reach the crash site, conduct a search, and return to base with reasonable reserves. As she climbed into the cockpit, Jessica felt the familiar sensation of coming home. The F-16's interior was cramped and utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort. Every switch, gauge, and control was positioned within easy reach, arranged according to principles of efficiency that had been refined through decades of combat experience. Unlike the glass cockpits of modern aircraft, the F-16's instrument panel was filled with analog gauges that provided immediate visual feedback without requiring computer interpretation. Jessica strapped herself into the ejection seat and began the startup sequence, her hands moving automatically through procedures she'd performed hundreds of times before. The F-16's engine spooled up with a low whine that gradually increased in pitch and intensity. Unlike the whisper-quiet operation of newer aircraft, the Fighting Falcon announced its presence with the kind of mechanical authority that came from proven engineering. As the aircraft systems came online, Jessica programmed her navigation equipment with the approximate coordinates of the search area. She also prepared backup navigation aids, including a magnetic compass and paper charts that would remain functional even if the F-16's electronic systems failed. It was old-fashioned preparation for an old-fashioned aircraft, but Jessica knew that redundancy was the key to survival in hostile environments. The taxiway leading from Hangar 7 to the main runway was poorly lit, forcing Jessica to navigate using the F-16's taxi lights and her own knowledge of the base layout. As she rolled slowly toward the departure end of the runway, she could see lights in the base operations center where the night shift was beginning their duties. None of them knew that she was about to launch an unauthorized rescue mission into some of the worst weather Alaska had to offer. Jessica reached the runway threshold and performed her final pre-takeoff checks. Engine parameters were normal, flight controls responded properly, and all navigation systems showed green status lights. The runway stretched ahead of her into the darkness, its centerline lights disappearing into the low clouds that hung over the base like a gray ceiling. For a moment, Jessica hesitated. Once she advanced the throttle and began her takeoff roll, there would be no turning back. She would be committed to a course of action that could end her military career, even if she succeeded in reaching the survivors. The regulations regarding unauthorized flights were clear and unforgiving, designed to prevent exactly the kind of rogue operation she was about to undertake. But then the radio crackled with another transmission from Flight 447, weaker than before, the voice barely audible above the static. "Please, if anyone can hear this, we're losing people. Children are scared. Please help us." Jessica advanced the throttle. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with the kind of authority that only single-engine fighters could provide. The acceleration pressed her back into her seat as the aircraft gathered speed, its landing gear vibrating against the concrete until the moment of liftoff when everything became smooth and controlled. Jessica retracted the gear and began climbing into the overcast sky, leaving the lights of Fairfield Air Base behind as she turned northeast toward the mountains. The weather conditions were worse than she'd expected. Visibility dropped to near zero as soon as she entered the cloud layer, and the F-16 was immediately buffeted by turbulence that threatened to overwhelm even its stable flight characteristics. Ice began forming on the canopy within minutes of entering the clouds, creating a crystalline web that distorted her view of the instrument panel. Jessica switched to instrument flight rules, relying entirely on her gauges and navigation equipment to maintain control of the aircraft. The F-16's analog instruments provided steady, reliable information that didn't depend on computer processing or satellite signals. Her airspeed indicator showed 450 knots. Her altitude was climbing through 15,000 feet, and her heading was steady, on the course that would take her toward the search area. The turbulence intensified as Jessica climbed higher, seeking an altitude where the weather might be more manageable. But instead of improving conditions, she found herself fighting increasingly violent air currents that threw the F-16 around like a toy. Ice continued to accumulate on the aircraft's surfaces, adding weight and disrupting the carefully designed aerodynamics that kept the fighter airborne. It was exactly the kind of weather that had forced the F-35s to abort their missions earlier. That day, Jessica could understand why the other pilots had made the decision to return to base rather than continue fighting conditions that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. Modern fighters were capable of incredible performance under ideal circumstances, but their sophisticated systems often became liabilities in extreme weather. The F-16, however, had been designed for exactly these conditions. Its analog flight controls provided direct mechanical feedback that allowed Jessica to feel every subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. When turbulence threw the fighter into an uncommanded roll, she could sense the motion through her hands and feet, making immediate corrections without waiting for computer systems to interpret and respond to the situation. 20 minutes into the flight, Jessica encountered the first real crisis of her unauthorized mission. A severe downdraft caught the F-16 and drove it toward the mountains below with frightening speed. The altimeter unwound rapidly as Jessica fought to regain control, her hands gripping the stick with white-knuckled intensity as she pulled back against forces that seemed determined to drive her into the rocky peaks. For several terrifying seconds, Jessica wasn't sure she would be able to recover from the downdraft. The F-16 continued descending despite her best efforts to arrest the fall, and she could see the jagged outlines of mountain ridges emerging from the clouds below. Ice crystals pelted the canopy like hail, and the engine struggled against the turbulent air that disrupted its normal operation. Then, just as Jessica was beginning to consider ejecting from the aircraft, the downdraft released its grip and the F-16 began climbing again. She pulled back on the stick with steady pressure, coaxing every bit of performance from an aircraft that was being tested beyond its normal limits. Gradually, the fighter clawed its way back to a safe altitude, its engine running smoothly despite the punishment it had endured. Jessica took a moment to check her position and assess the damage from her encounter with the severe weather. The F-16's navigation system showed that she was still on course toward the search area, though the turbulence had cost her valuable time and fuel. Ice continued to accumulate on the aircraft's surfaces, but the fighter's proven design was handling the additional weight without significant performance degradation. More concerning was the effect the weather was having on her radio communications. Static filled her headset, making it difficult to distinguish between atmospheric interference and actual transmissions. Jessica tried repeatedly to re-establish contact with Flight 447, but received only fragments of broken signals that might have been human voices or might have been electronic noise generated by the storm systems. As she flew deeper into the mountain wilderness, Jessica began to understand why so many search and rescue attempts had failed in this region. The terrain below was a maze of peaks and valleys, each one looking virtually identical from the air. Navigation landmarks that were clearly visible on maps became invisible in the low visibility conditions, and the magnetic anomalies caused by iron ore deposits in the mountains played havoc with compass readings. Jessica relied increasingly on dead reckoning navigation, using her knowledge of airspeed, heading, and elapsed time to estimate her position. It was a technique that required constant mental calculation and absolute faith in one's ability to maintain accurate flight parameters despite challenging conditions. Modern pilots rarely bothered to master such old-fashioned skills, but Jessica's preference for traditional methods was now proving invaluable. 35 minutes into the flight, Jessica finally broke through the cloud layer and found herself flying in relatively clear air above a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks shrouded in clouds and their valleys hidden in shadow. Snow covered everything, creating a monochromatic wilderness that offered few clues about specific locations or terrain features. Jessica reduced her altitude and began following the major valleys, looking for any sign of aircraft wreckage or survivor activity. The F-16's fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the severe weather conditions, and she knew that her search time was limited. Every minute spent looking for the crash site was a minute less fuel available for the return trip to base. The first valley she searched yielded nothing but endless stretches of snow-covered wilderness. Jessica flew a systematic search pattern, using the F-16's maneuverability to explore side canyons and hidden areas, where wreckage might not be visible from higher altitudes. The aircraft responded beautifully to her control inputs, its proven design allowing her to fly precisely even in the turbulent air that swirled between the mountain peaks. The second valley was larger and more complex, with multiple branches that could easily hide the wreckage of a commercial airliner. Jessica flew deeper into the mountains, following terrain features that matched the survivors' descriptions of their location. The radio remained largely silent, filled with static and interference that made communication impossible. It was in the third valley that Jessica first saw signs of human activity. Smoke was rising from a location near the valley floor, too, steady and controlled to be a natural forest fire. Jessica banked the F-16 toward the smoke, her heart racing as she realized she might have found the crash site. As she flew closer, she could make out scattered debris on the snow-covered ground, pieces of metal and fabric that could only have come from an aircraft. Jessica circled the area at low altitude, trying to get a better view of the situation. Below, the wreckage was scattered across a wide area, indicating that the airliner had broken apart either during the crash or upon impact with the mountainous terrain. Some pieces of debris were large enough to provide shelter for survivors, and Jessica could see movement near what appeared to be the aircraft's main fuselage section. More importantly, she could see people waving at her from the ground, their bright clothing contrasting sharply with the white snow that covered everything else. Jessica counted at least a dozen figures gathered around the wreckage site, though. She knew there were probably more survivors taking shelter inside the aircraft's remains. Jessica tried to establish radio contact with the survivors, transmitting on the emergency frequency they'd been using earlier. For several minutes, there was no response, and Jessica began to worry that their radio equipment had finally failed. Completely. Then, faint but unmistakable, she heard a human voice through the static. Aircraft overhead. This is Flight 447. We can see you. Thank God you found us. The relief in the survivor's voice was overwhelming, carrying the weight of hours spent hoping that someone would come looking for them. Jessica felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that her unauthorized mission had actually succeeded in locating the missing passengers and crew. Flight 447. This is Lieutenant Park from Fairfield Air Base. I can see you on the ground, and help is on the way. What's your current status? The response came back stronger now, as if the sight of a rescue aircraft had given the survivors new strength. Lieutenant, we have 27 people still alive. Many injured, 3 children among survivors. We've been trying to keep everyone warm, but supplies running low. 27 survivors out of 63 passengers and crew. The numbers were sobering, but Jessica focused on the fact that there were still people alive who could be saved if rescue operations could reach them quickly enough. The key was getting their exact location back to Fairfield Air Base and coordinating a proper rescue mission with helicopters and ground teams. Jessica began circling the crash site while documenting every detail she could observe from the air. The wreckage was located in a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountain walls, accessible only by helicopter or through extremely difficult overland routes. The terrain would challenge even experienced rescue teams, but it was definitely reachable with proper equipment and planning. More importantly, Jessica could see that there was an area near the crash site that might be suitable for helicopter landing operations. The space was limited and would require skilled pilots, but it appeared large enough and flat enough to accommodate rescue aircraft under favorable weather conditions. As Jessica continued her reconnaissance of the crash site, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Off to one side of the main wreckage area, partially hidden by snow and debris, she could see the distinctive outline of a military fighter aircraft. The fuselage was cracked and twisted, the wings torn away by impact forces, but the overall shape was unmistakably that of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. Captain Sarah Chen's aircraft had finally been found. Jessica stared down at the wreckage of Chen's F-16, trying to process the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. 8 years ago, Chen had been flying a routine training mission when weather conditions forced her to attempt an emergency landing in this remote valley. She died alone in the wilderness, her fate unknown until this moment when another pilot had followed her path into the same deadly terrain. The sight of Chen's wreckage served as a stark reminder of the risks Jessica was taking with her unauthorized rescue mission. The weather conditions that had killed Chen were similar to what Jessica was experiencing now, and the outcome could easily be the same. But the knowledge that 27 people were depending on her gave Jessica the strength to push aside her fears and focus on completing the mission. Jessica spent another 10 minutes documenting the crash site and surrounding terrain, taking mental notes that she could relay to rescue coordinators back at base. The F-16's fuel gauge was showing decreasing reserves, but she still had enough fuel to return to Fairfield Air Base with reasonable safety margins. The hardest part of her mission was now complete. She'd found the survivors and confirmed their location. As Jessica prepared to leave the area and return to base, she made one final radio transmission to the survivors below. Flight 447, I have your position, and I'm returning to base to coordinate rescue operations. Help will be coming as soon as weather conditions permit helicopter operations. Keep everyone together and maintain your shelter until rescue teams arrive. The response from the ground was filled with gratitude and relief. Thank you, Lieutenant. Thank you for finding us. We'll be waiting. Jessica banked the F-16 away from the crash site and began the long flight back to Fairfield Air Base, The weather conditions had improved slightly during her time over the mountains, but the return trip would still be challenging. Ice continued to accumulate on the aircraft surfaces, and visibility remained poor as she climbed back into the cloud layer. But Jessica felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended the physical discomfort and professional risks of her unauthorized mission. She'd proven that sometimes old-fashioned methods and equipment could succeed where modern technology failed. More importantly, she'd given 27 people a realistic chance of survival by locating them and confirming their position for rescue teams. The flight back to base passed more quickly than the outbound journey, though Jessica remained vigilant. For the severe turbulence and icing conditions that had nearly brought her down earlier, the F-16 performed flawlessly, its proven design handling the challenging weather with the kind of reliability that had made it one of the most successful fighter aircraft in aviation history. As Jessica approached Fairfield Air Base, she could see emergency vehicles positioned around the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. Word of her unauthorized mission had obviously reached base operations, and she was about to face the consequences of her decision to disobey direct orders. But as the F-16's wheels touched down on the familiar runway, Jessica felt no regret about her actions. She'd saved lives, located survivors that might otherwise have died in the wilderness, and proven that experience and determination could overcome technological limitations. Whatever happened next, she could face it with the knowledge that she'd done the right thing when it mattered most. The F-16 rolled to a stop near the approach end of the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and military personnel. Jessica shut down the engine and opened the canopy, feeling the cold Alaska air rush into the cockpit as she prepared to face the consequences of her unauthorized rescue mission. Colonel Hayes was among the first to reach her aircraft, his expression unreadable in the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. Behind him, Jessica could see Major Thompson and several other officers from the morning briefing, along with medical personnel and base security staff. As Jessica climbed down from the cockpit, Hayes stepped forward to meet her. "Lieutenant Park," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The debriefing room at Fairfield Air Base had never felt smaller than it did at 03:00 hours on that October morning. Jessica sat at the metal table, her flight suit still damp with sweat and marked with the residue of her unauthorized journey into the Alaskan wilderness. Across from her, Colonel Hayes studied a stack of papers while Major Thompson paced behind his chair, his agitation barely contained. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Hayes finally looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face showing the strain of a commander dealing with an unprecedented situation. "Lieutenant Park, before we discuss the disciplinary aspects of your actions tonight, I need to understand exactly what you found out there." Jessica straightened in her chair, forcing herself to maintain professional composure despite her exhaustion. "Sir, I located Flight 447's crash site approximately 47 nautical miles northeast of base. Coordinates 65, 7 north, 146, 3 west. 27 survivors confirmed alive, including 3 children. The wreckage is scattered across a valley floor, with the main fuselage section providing shelter for most of the survivors." Thompson stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You're telling us that you accomplished in 3 hours what our entire search and rescue operation couldn't manage with 4 state-of-the-art aircraft?" "Yes, sir. I also located the wreckage of Captain Sarah Chen's F-16, tail number 860193, at the same site." The room fell silent. Chen's disappearance 8 years ago had become something of a legend at Fairfield Air Base, a reminder of how quickly the Alaskan wilderness could claim even the most experienced pilots. Multiple search efforts had failed to locate her aircraft, and the case had eventually been closed with her remains listed as unrecoverable. Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense. "You're certain about Chen's aircraft?" "Positive identification, sir." The wreckage is approximately 200 meters east of Flight 447's main impact site. The aircraft appears to have suffered catastrophic structural failure upon impact, consistent with a forced landing in severe weather conditions. Thompson resumed his pacing, his frustration evident in every movement. This doesn't change the fact that you violated direct orders, endangered military equipment, and conducted an unauthorized flight operation in hazardous conditions. The regulations regarding unauthorized flights are clear and non-negotiable. Jessica had expected this response from Thompson, but she was prepared to defend her actions. "Sir, with respect, I was responding to an emergency situation where lives were at stake. The survivors were transmitting on frequencies that only older aircraft like the F-16 are equipped to monitor. Without my intervention, they would have died before rescue operations could locate them." Hayes held up a hand to stop Thompson's response. "Park, I understand your motivation, but Major Thompson raises valid concerns about operational discipline. Military effectiveness depends on following orders and maintaining chain of command, especially during crisis situations." "I understand that, sir. But sometimes following orders means allowing preventable deaths to occur. I had the capability to save those people, and the weather window was closing rapidly. By morning, they might have been beyond rescue." Thompson slammed his hand on the table, his composure finally breaking. "This is exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that gets people killed. You think your vintage aircraft and old-school flying skills make you special, but what you've done is demonstrate a complete disregard for military discipline and safety protocols." Jessica met Thompson's angry stare without flinching. "Sir, my aircraft performed flawlessly in conditions that grounded your F-35s, sometimes older. Technology is more reliable than newer systems. Your aircraft is a 30-year-old relic that belongs in a museum, not in operational service. That 30-year-old relic just saved 27 lives." The argument was interrupted by a sharp knock on the debriefing room door. Sergeant Williams entered, carrying a radio and wearing the expression of someone bringing urgent news. "Colonel Hayes, sir, we're receiving multiple transmissions from the crash site. The survivors are reporting that several injured passengers have taken a turn for the worse. They're requesting immediate medical evacuation." Hayes took the radio from Williams and listened to the broken transmissions, coming from Flight 447. Even through the static and interference, the desperation in the survivor's voice was unmistakable. People were dying in that remote valley, and conventional rescue operations were still hours away from being able to reach them. "What's the current status of our search and rescue helicopters?" Hayes asked. Williams consulted his clipboard. "Sir, the weather is still too severe for helicopter operations. Wind speeds are gusting to 60 knots, with visibility less than half a mile. The earliest we can launch rescue birds is dawn, assuming conditions improve." Thompson stepped forward. "Sir, we should coordinate with civilian rescue agencies. They might have capabilities that we don't." "Already tried. Major, the Coast Guard and civilian rescue services are dealing with the same weather limitations that we are. Nobody's flying in these conditions." Jessica stood up from her chair, knowing that she was about to make her situation even worse, but unable to remain silent. "Sir, I could make another flight to the crash site. The F-16 proved it can operate in current conditions, and I could drop medical supplies to the survivors." Thompson stared at her in disbelief. "You want to compound your insubordination by making another unauthorized flight?" "I want to save lives, sir. Those people don't have until dawn. They need help now." Hayes studied Jessica carefully, weighing the military regulations that demanded her immediate arrest against the humanitarian crisis that was unfolding in real time. "Park, what you're suggesting would be even more dangerous than your first mission. Dropping supplies at night in severe weather conditions to a remote location surrounded by mountains, using an aircraft that wasn't designed for that kind of precision work. Sir, The F-16 has been used for ground attack missions throughout its operational history. I can modify the external fuel tanks to carry medical supplies and survival equipment. The survivors have signal fires burning to mark their location, and I have the exact coordinates from my previous flight. Thompson was shaking his head before Jessica finished speaking. This is insane. You're talking about turning a fighter aircraft into an improvised cargo plane, flying a night mission in conditions that have already grounded our entire rescue helicopter fleet. The alternative is watching those people die while we wait for perfect weather conditions that might not come for days. The radio crackled with another transmission from the crash site, weaker than before, but still audible. Fairfield Air Base, please respond. We're losing people. Children are getting worse. Please help us. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, and Jessica could see the weight of command pressing down on him. Every decision he made would have consequences that extended far beyond military regulations and career considerations. 27 people were counting on him to find a way to reach them before hypothermia and untreated injuries claimed more lives. When Hayes opened his eyes, his expression was resolute. Park, if I were to authorize such a mission, what would you need? Thompson's face went pale. Sir, you can't be seriously considering this. Major, those are American citizens dying out there. Military personnel, civilian passengers, and children who are depending on us to save them. If we have the capability to help them, then we have the responsibility to try. Jessica felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Sir, I would need medical supplies configured for airdrop, survival equipment including emergency shelters and heating devices, and authorization to modify my aircraft's external fuel tanks for cargo carrying. How long would you need to prepare for such a mission? 30 minutes to configure the aircraft, 15 minutes for final checks and briefing. I could be airborne within the hour. Hayes turned to Thompson. Major, I want you to coordinate with base medical staff to prepare an emergency supply drop. Include morphine, antibiotics, emergency surgical supplies, and anything else the flight surgeon recommends for trauma patients. Thompson's expression showed his complete disagreement with the decision, but his response was professionally correct. Yes, sir. I'll coordinate with medical and logistics immediately. Sergeant Williams, I want you to establish continuous radio contact with the crash site survivors. Let them know that help is on the way and get detailed information about their medical needs. As the others left to prepare for the unprecedented rescue mission, Hayes remained behind with Jessica. For several moments, they sat in silence, both understanding the magnitude of what was about to happen. Park, I want you to understand something. If this mission succeeds, it will be remembered as one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in Air Force history. If it fails, we'll both be facing court-martial proceedings that could end our careers. Jessica nodded. I understand the risk, sir. But I also understand that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting personal consequences. Hayes studied her with the expression of a commander trying to measure the character of someone under his command. You remind me of Captain Chen. She had the same willingness to take risks when lives were at stake. It's what made her a good pilot, and it's ultimately what killed her. Sir, Chen died because she was alone out there with no support and no way to communicate her situation. I have radio contact with base, confirmed coordinates for the crash site, and detailed knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions. You also have an aircraft that's 3 decades old, operating in weather conditions that have defeated newer and more sophisticated machines. Yes, sir. But sometimes experience trumps innovation. Hayes stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the flight line. In the distance, Jessica could see ground crews working around her F-16, preparing it for a mission that no one had ever attempted before. Floodlights illuminated the work area, creating a pool of bright white light in the surrounding darkness. Park, I'm going to authorize this mission, because I believe it's our best chance of saving those people. But I want you to understand that you'll be flying alone into some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable, attempting a precision supply drop that would challenge even the most experienced cargo aircraft crews. I understand, sir. If you encounter problems that compromise your safety or the safety of the aircraft, I want you to abort the mission and return to base immediately. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We can't help anyone if we lose you too. Jessica stood and faced her commanding officer. Sir, I won't let you down. Hayes turned from the window and extended his hand. Lieutenant, you've already proven more than you needed to prove tonight. Now go save some lives. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of intense preparation as ground crews worked to modify Jessica's F-16 for its unprecedented rescue mission. The aircraft's external fuel tanks were replaced with specially configured containers designed to carry medical supplies and survival equipment. Each container was equipped with parachutes and impact-resistant padding to ensure that the supplies would survive the drop and be usable by the survivors. Base medical staff worked frantically to prepare emergency medical kits containing everything that trauma patients might need in a wilderness survival situation. Morphine and other pain medications, antibiotics to prevent infection, emergency surgical supplies for treating severe injuries, and thermal blankets designed to prevent hypothermia. Each item was carefully packaged and labeled, then loaded into the modified drop containers. Logistics personnel contributed survival equipment that could make the difference between life and death for people stranded in the Alaskan wilderness. Emergency shelters that could be erected quickly in severe weather, portable heating devices that used chemical reactions to generate warmth, and high-energy food supplies that required no preparation. Everything was selected for maximum utility in extreme conditions. Jessica spent the preparation time studying weather reports and refining her approach to the supply drop. The crash site was located in a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides, requiring a precise approach that would bring her F-16 dangerously close to the mountain ridges. The survivors had managed to maintain signal fires that would be visible from the air, but approaching them at night in severe weather would test every skill she developed as a pilot. The modified external tanks would change the F-16's flight characteristics, adding weight and drag that would affect its performance in challenging conditions. Jessica reviewed the aircraft's handling notes and calculated approach speeds that would give her the best chance of making an accurate drop, while maintaining sufficient control authority to escape the valley safely. Major Thompson appeared at Jessica's side as she completed her mission planning. His earlier antagonism had been replaced by professional concern, though his doubts about the operation remained evident. Park, I've spoken with the flight surgeon about the medical supplies you'll be carrying. He wants you to know that morphine and other controlled substances are included in the drop packages. If this mission fails and those supplies end up scattered across the wilderness, we'll be dealing with drug recovery operations on top of everything else. Jessica looked up from her charts. Sir, the packages are designed to remain intact upon impact. The survivors know to expect the drop and will be able to recover the supplies immediately. What if your navigation is off? What if the drop misses the target area entirely? Then those people die and we have to live with the knowledge that we didn't try hard enough to save them. Thompson was quiet for a moment, studying the weather reports that showed continued deterioration in the northern sectors. For what it's worth, Park, I hope you prove me wrong about this whole operation. Sir, I'm not trying to prove anything except that sometimes you have to take risks to save lives. Just remember that heroism and recklessness often look identical, until you know how the story ends. The final modifications to Jessica's F-16 were completed just as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon. The aircraft looked different with its cargo-carrying configuration, less sleek and predatory than a standard fighter, but somehow more purposeful. Ground crews had painted emergency identification markings on the modified tanks, ensuring that the survivors would recognize the supply containers as military equipment. Jessica conducted her final pre-flight inspection with even more care than usual, knowing that equipment failure during this mission could be catastrophic for both her and the people she was trying to save. Every external component was checked and double-checked, every connection verified and secured. The modified tanks added complexity to the aircraft systems, but everything appeared to be functioning correctly. Colonel Hayes appeared on the flight line as Jessica prepared to start her engines. In his hands, he carried a thermos of coffee and a manila folder containing updated weather information and emergency contact frequencies. Last chance to reconsider, Park. The weather reports are showing continued deterioration in the target area. Visibility is dropping and wind speeds are increasing. Jessica accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through her hands as she held the thermos. Sir, if I don't go now, those people won't survive to see improved weather conditions. Hayes handed her the folder. Updated coordinates from the survivors, plus emergency frequencies for Canadian rescue services in case you need to divert across the border. The crash site is only about 20 miles from Canadian airspace. Thank you, sir. That could be valuable if I encounter problems during the return flight. Park, there's something else you should know. We've been monitoring long-range weather forecasts, and it appears that this storm system is more extensive than originally predicted. You might be facing deteriorating conditions throughout the entire mission. Jessica climbed into the F-16's cockpit and began her startup procedures, her hands moving through the familiar sequence while her mind focused on the challenges ahead. The modified external tanks would affect the aircraft's center of gravity and flight characteristics, requiring constant attention to maintain proper control. The weather conditions would test both her flying skills and the F-16's mechanical reliability. Most importantly, the precision required for the supply drop would push both aircraft and pilot to their operational limits. The F-16's engine spooled up with its characteristic whine, the sound echoing off the hangar walls and signaling the beginning of the most important mission of Jessica's career. Ground crews removed the wheel chocks and stepped clear of the aircraft, their work complete. Jessica was now alone with her machine, preparing to venture once again into the hostile wilderness that had already claimed one pilot's life. As Jessica taxied toward the runway, she could see personnel from throughout the base gathering to watch her departure. Word of the unauthorized rescue mission had spread quickly, and everyone understood that they were witnessing either an act of extraordinary heroism or a tragic exercise in misguided bravery. Time would determine which version of events would be recorded in official reports. The runway stretched ahead of Jessica, its lights disappearing into the gray dawn sky that promised another day of challenging weather. The F-16 felt heavier than usual with its cargo load, requiring more runway distance for takeoff and careful attention to airspeed throughout the departure sequence. Jessica advanced the throttle and felt the familiar acceleration that marked the beginning of every flight, but this time the stakes were higher than they'd ever been before. The F-16 lifted off into the overcast sky, climbing steadily toward the mountains where 27 people waited for help that only she could deliver. Behind her, Fairfield Air Base faded into the gray distance as Jessica turned northeast toward a rendezvous with destiny that would determine whether her unauthorized actions would be remembered as heroic or foolhardy. The weather conditions were worse than during her first flight, with visibility dropping to near zero as soon as she entered the cloud layer. Ice began forming on the aircraft's surfaces immediately, adding weight and disrupting the carefully calculated aerodynamics that kept the heavily loaded fighter airborne. The modified external tanks created additional drag that forced Jessica to maintain higher engine power settings, increasing fuel consumption and reducing her margin for error. Turbulence buffeted the F-16 continuously, requiring constant control inputs to maintain level flight. The cargo load made the aircraft less responsive to control movements, forcing Jessica to anticipate weather conditions and make control adjustments before the turbulence could overwhelm the fighter's stability. It was exhausting flying that demanded total concentration and perfect technique. Navigation became increasingly difficult as magnetic anomalies in the mountains interfered with compass readings and ice accumulation blocked external reference points. Jessica relied heavily on dead reckoning techniques, using her knowledge of elapsed time, airspeed, and heading to estimate her position relative to the crash site. It was old-fashioned navigation that required constant mental calculation and absolute faith in her ability to maintain accurate flight parameters. 25 minutes into the flight, Jessica encountered the same severe downdraft that had nearly brought her down during the previous mission. This time, however, the F-16's heavier weight and modified configuration made recovery even more challenging. The aircraft fell toward the mountains with frightening speed, its engines struggling against air currents that seemed determined to drive her into the rocky peaks below. Jessica fought the downdraft with everything she'd learned about flying. In extreme conditions, using every technique her instructors had taught her about maintaining control in hostile environments. The F-16 responded sluggishly to her control inputs, its performance compromised by the additional weight and drag of the cargo containers. For several terrifying moments, Jessica wasn't sure she would be able to prevent the aircraft from impacting the mountains. Then, just as the rocky ridges were becoming clearly visible through the ice-covered canopy, the downdraft released its grip and the F-16 began climbing again. Jessica pulled back on the stick with steady pressure, coaxing performance from an aircraft that was operating at the very edge of its capabilities. Gradually, the fighter clawed its way back to a safe altitude, though the encounter had cost precious fuel and added stress to both aircraft and pilot. As Jessica approached the crash site, she could see the signal fires that the survivors had maintained throughout the night. The orange flames stood out clearly against the white snow, providing the navigation reference she needed to locate the precise drop coordinates. The valley looked even more treacherous than she remembered, with steep walls on both sides and limited maneuvering room for an aircraft carrying external cargo. Jessica established radio contact with the survivors as she began her approach to the drop zone. Their voices came through filled with hope and desperation, the sound of people who had been waiting for help through the longest night of their lives. Flight 447. This is Lieutenant Park approaching your position with medical supplies and survival equipment. I need you to mark the drop zone with additional signal fires if possible. The response came back immediately. Lieutenant Park, we can see you approaching. We've prepared the drop zone and everyone is taking shelter. Thank God you came back for us. Jessica lined up her approach carefully, using the signal fires as reference points while monitoring her airspeed and altitude. The modified external tanks would be released at precisely the right moment to ensure that the supplies landed within easy reach of the survivors. There would be no second chance. The F-16's fuel reserves were limited, and the weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate. The valley walls closed in around the F-16 as Jessica descended toward the drop altitude. Wind currents swirled between the mountain peaks, creating turbulence that threatened to throw the heavily loaded aircraft into the rocky walls. Jessica fought to maintain precise control, her hands gripping the stick with intense concentration as she approached the critical moment when the supplies would be released. At exactly the right moment, Jessica triggered the release mechanism for the modified external tanks. The cargo containers separated from the F-16 cleanly, their parachutes deploying automatically as they fell toward the crash site below. Jessica immediately began a climbing turn to escape the valley, the F-16 suddenly lighter and more responsive without its cargo load. From her cockpit, Jessica could see the supply containers descending toward the survivors, their parachutes clearly visible against the snow-covered ground. The drop appeared to be accurate, with both containers landing within the designated zone where the survivors could recover them quickly. It was a perfect execution of an impossible mission, accomplished under conditions that should have made success impossible. But as Jessica climbed out of the valley and turned toward home, she realized that her troubles were far from over. The severe weather conditions had worsened during her time over the crash site, and the return flight to Fairfield Air Base would be even more challenging than the outbound journey. Ice continued to accumulate on the F-16 surfaces, and fuel consumption was higher than planned due to the extreme conditions. More concerning was the fact that Jessica was now flying alone through some of the worst weather Alaska had to offer, in an aircraft that was showing signs of stress from the challenging mission profile. The F-16 had performed magnificently throughout the operation, but 30-year-old machines had their limits, and Jessica was pushing those limits to their absolute maximum. As she flew through the mountain wilderness toward home, Jessica allowed herself a moment to appreciate what she'd accomplished. 27 people now had the medical supplies and survival equipment they needed to survive until conventional rescue operations could reach them. Children who had been facing hypothermia now had emergency heating devices to keep them warm. Injured passengers had access to pain, medication, and antibiotics that could prevent their conditions from becoming life-threatening. It had been an extraordinary night that had tested every skill Jessica possessed as a pilot and as a human being. She'd proven that sometimes courage and determination could overcome technological limitations and bureaucratic obstacles. Most importantly, she demonstrated that when lives were at stake, the right thing to do was act rather than wait for perfect conditions that might never come. The lights of Fairfield Air Base appeared through the clouds ahead, marking the end of a mission that would be remembered for years to come. Jessica lined up her approach to the runway, knowing that she was about to face questions and consequences that would determine the future of her military career. But regardless of what happened next, she knew that she'd done everything possible to save the lives of people who were depending on her. The F-16 touched down on the familiar runway with a gentle thump, its journey complete after a night that had changed everything. The emergency vehicles that surrounded Jessica's F-16 as she taxied to a halt were a stark contrast to the silent departure she'd made hours earlier. Red and blue lights flashed across the tarmac, creating an almost festive atmosphere that seemed inappropriate for the gravity of what had just transpired. Ground crews rushed forward to secure the aircraft while Colonel Hayes and a gathering crowd of base personnel waited nearby. Jessica shut down the engines and opened the canopy, feeling the familiar rush of cold Alaskan air that signaled the end of another flight. But this landing was different from any she'd experienced before. The weight of what she'd accomplished, combined with the uncertainty of what consequences awaited her, created a strange mixture of pride and apprehension that made her hands tremble slightly as she removed her helmet. As Jessica climbed down from the cockpit, she was surprised to see that the crowd included not just military personnel, but also civilians who had somehow learned about the rescue operation. Among them were base support staff, family members of military personnel, and even some local residents who had driven to Fairfield to witness the conclusion of an extraordinary night. Colonel Hayes approached first, his expression unreadable in the flashing emergency lights. Behind him, Major Thompson walked with the measured pace of someone who had reluctantly accepted that his initial judgment might have been wrong. The tension between the two officers was palpable, representing the larger conflict between following regulations and taking necessary risks to save lives. "Lieutenant Park," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the wind. "Report." Jessica stood at attention, her flight suit still bearing the evidence of her challenging mission. "Sir, supply drop completed successfully. Both containers delivered to target coordinates with confirmed recovery by survivors." 27 souls still alive and now equipped with medical supplies and survival equipment necessary to sustain them until rescue operations can reach the site. Hayes nodded slowly, processing the information while studying Jessica's face for signs of the stress she'd endured during the past few hours. Any complications during the mission? Weather. Conditions were severe, but within acceptable parameters for the F-16's capabilities, sir. The aircraft performed flawlessly throughout the operation. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd as people realized that the unauthorized rescue mission had actually succeeded. Jessica could see surprise and admiration in many faces, though. Others showed the kind of skepticism that came from years of military service, where unusual actions rarely produced positive outcomes. Major Thompson stepped forward, his earlier antagonism replaced by something approaching grudging respect. "Park, I owe you an apology. When you first proposed using your aircraft for this mission, I thought you were engaging in dangerous showboating." "I was wrong." Jessica met Thompson's gaze steadily. "Sir, I wasn't trying to prove anything about myself or my aircraft. I was simply responding to an emergency situation with the tools and skills available to me. Nevertheless, what you've accomplished tonight will be remembered as one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in Air Force history." The radio crackled with a transmission from the crash site, drawing everyone's attention to the emergency communication equipment that Sergeant Williams was monitoring. The voice that came through was stronger than before, filled with gratitude and relief that transcended the static and interference. "Fairfield Air Base, this is Flight 447. The supplies have been recovered and distributed to injured passengers. Medical treatment is already underway for the most critical cases. We cannot express adequate gratitude for what Lieutenant Park has done for us tonight." Hayes took the radio microphone and responded personally. "Flight 447, this is Colonel Hayes, commanding officer at Fairfield. Lieutenant Park's actions tonight represent the very best of military service and humanitarian commitment. Rescue helicopters will reach your position as soon as weather conditions permit, probably within the next 6 hours. Colonel, please tell Lieutenant Park that she saved lives tonight. Without those medical supplies, we would have lost at least 3 more people before morning. She's a hero, sir." Jessica felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the survivor's words. Throughout the night, she'd focused on the technical challenges of the mission rather than the human impact of her actions. Hearing directly from the people she'd helped made the risks and consequences seem worthwhile, regardless of what happened to her career. The crowd around Jessica's aircraft continued to grow as word of the successful mission spread throughout the base. Maintenance personnel who had worked on her F-16, communications staff who had monitored the emergency frequencies, and pilots who had been grounded by the same weather conditions that Jessica had conquered. Each person seemed to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Colonel Hayes gestured for Jessica to follow him away from the crowd, toward a quieter area near the base operations building. As they walked, he spoke in the tone of a commander who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to accept responsibility for its consequences. "Park, what you've done tonight presents me with a significant dilemma. On one hand, you violated direct orders and conducted an unauthorized flight operation in hazardous conditions. Military discipline requires that such actions have consequences, regardless of their outcomes." Jessica nodded, understanding the position that Hayes faced as a commanding officer. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions and whatever disciplinary measures you deem appropriate. On the other hand, you've saved 27 lives using skills and equipment that others considered obsolete. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and courage that the Air Force expects from its officers, even if your methods were unconventional." They reached the operations building, and Hayes paused, looking back toward Jessica's F-16 where ground crews were beginning their post-flight inspection. The aircraft showed the effects of its challenging mission, with ice still clinging to some surfaces and stress, marks visible on the landing gear from the heavy cargo operations. Park, I've spoken with higher headquarters about tonight's events. There will be an official investigation, as required by regulations regarding unauthorized flights. However, I've also recommended you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions in saving civilian lives under extraordinary circumstances. Jessica stared at Hayes in surprise. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the military's highest awards for heroism in flight, typically reserved for combat operations or exceptional acts of courage. The possibility that her unauthorized mission might result in recognition rather than punishment had never occurred to her. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say that you'll continue to use your skills and judgment to serve others, but perhaps with better coordination with your chain of command in the future. Hayes smiled slightly, the first time Jessica had seen him show anything approaching humor during the entire crisis. Park, what you've proven tonight is that sometimes experience and determination can overcome technological advantages and bureaucratic obstacles. That's a lesson that everyone on this base needed to learn. In the distance, the first helicopters of the rescue operation were beginning their pre-flight preparations. The weather conditions had improved enough to allow conventional rescue aircraft to attempt reaching the crash site, meaning that the survivors would soon have professional medical care and evacuation to proper facilities. Jessica's emergency supply drop had bought them the time they needed to survive until help could arrive. Major Thompson approached them, carrying a folder that Jessica recognized as official paperwork requiring her signature. His expression was no longer antagonistic, but rather showed the respect that came from witnessing someone prove their capabilities under impossible circumstances. Park, I need your signature on the mission report documenting tonight's activities. I want you to know that I've included a personal recommendation for commendation based on your performance. Jessica signed the papers, knowing that they would become part of an official record that would follow her throughout her military career. But more importantly, they documented the fact that 27 people were alive because someone had been willing to take risks that others considered unacceptable. As the sun began to rise over the Alaskan mountains, casting its first light across Fairfield Air Base, Jessica realized that everything had changed. Her fellow pilots no longer looked at her as an oddity who preferred obsolete aircraft to modern technology. Ground crews who had dismissed her F-16 as a museum piece now understood that proven reliability could be more valuable than cutting-edge innovation. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle when lives were at stake. The rescue helicopters lifted off into the dawn sky, their rotor blades beating against the cold air as they headed toward the crash site, where 27 people waited for evacuation. Jessica watched them disappear into the distance, knowing that her part in the rescue operation was complete, but that the memory of this night would remain with her forever. Colonel Hayes placed his hand on Jessica's shoulder, a gesture of respect between two professionals who understood the weight of command decisions and the courage required to make them. Park, you've given everyone on this base a lesson in what it means to serve others. That F-16 of yours isn't just a vintage aircraft anymore. It's a symbol of what can be accomplished when skill and determination meet human need. Jessica looked back at her aircraft, sitting quietly in the growing daylight while ground crews completed their inspection. The F-16 appeared unchanged by its extraordinary mission, just another military aircraft waiting for its next assignment. But Jessica knew that something fundamental had shifted in how others perceived both her and her machine. No longer would she be called museum or treated as someone living in the past. The F-16 would never again be dismissed as obsolete technology, unsuitable for contemporary operations. Most importantly, Jessica had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from following orders, but from having the courage to do what was right when others lacked the will to act. The story of Flight 447's rescue would be told, and retold throughout the Air Force, becoming legend that inspired future generations of pilots to remember that their primary mission was not to operate sophisticated machinery, but to serve humanity when it needed them most. And at the center of that story would be a quiet lieutenant and her 30-year-old fighter, proving that heroism often came disguised as ordinary people, doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded nothing less than their very best. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.